Fleet Admiral Vexaron stood at the viewing platform of his command vessel, watching the endless darkness of space stretch before him like a canvas of infinite possibility. And behind him floated the greatest military force the Velkarn Dominion had ever assembled in one place. 10,000 warships hung in perfect formation, their hulls gleaming with the cold light of distant stars, each vessel carrying hundreds of the finest warriors the galaxy had ever known. And together, they represented a power that had crushed over 300 species across 4 galactic arms without ever tasting defeat. The Admiral turned his 4 eyes toward the holographic display that hovered beside him, showing a small blue and green world spinning slowly in the void. And he felt nothing but contempt for the creatures that called it home Earth. They called it a world of water and soil and primitive life forms that had only recently discovered how to travel between stars. And these humans had made the terrible mistake of refusing to submit to Dominion rule when given the chance. Admiral, his second-in-command, called out from across the bridge. The fleet reports full readiness and all weapon systems are charged and waiting for your command. Vexaron nodded slowly, his scaled face showing no emotion as he processed this information. For he had led countless invasions, and this one would be no different from the others. The Velkarn High Council had questioned his decision to bring such an overwhelming force against a single primitive world, arguing that perhaps 100 ships would be enough to handle creatures who had barely learned to leave their own atmosphere. But Vexaron believed in crushing his enemies completely and leaving no room for resistance or hope. He had studied the intelligence reports carefully, learning everything his scouts had discovered about these strange beings called humans. And what he found was almost laughable in its weakness. The humans possessed only 47 military vessels to defend their entire world. Small ships with crude weapons that fired simple metal projectiles and basic energy beams that could barely scratch the paint on a Dominion cruiser. And they had no planetary shields to protect their cities from orbital bombardment. Their world was divided into hundreds of small territories that constantly argued and fought with each other over resources and ideas, unable to unite even in the face of total annihilation. And their leaders wasted time debating and voting instead of taking decisive action. They are children playing at war, Vexaron said to himself as he reviewed the data once more. And we shall teach them what true power looks like. What the Admiral did not understand, what his scouts had completely failed to grasp, was that humanity's constant internal conflicts had forged them into something the galaxy had never seen before, while other species had evolved in peace and learned war only when they met hostile neighbors among the stars. Humans had been killing each other since before they could write their own names, developing weapons and tactics and strategies through thousands of years of bloody experience. They had invented new ways to destroy each other with every passing generation, from simple clubs and spears to atomic bombs that could erase cities in a flash of light. And they had never stopped preparing for the next conflict, even during times of peace. The humans knew something that the Velkarn had forgotten long ago: that survival was never guaranteed, and that anyone who wanted to live had to be ready to fight for every single breath. But Vexaron saw none of this as he gave the order for his fleet to begin the jump toward Earth. Confident that this campaign would be over within a single planetary rotation, send a message to the High Council. He instructed his communications officer. Inform them that the conquest of Earth begins now, and that we expect to accept their surrender before the sun sets on their capital city. The officer bowed and turned to carry out his orders, while Vexaron began composing the victory report he would send after the battle. Already planning the celebration he would hold aboard his flagship once the humans were crushed beneath his heel across the fleet. 9 million Velkarn warriors prepared for what they believed would be an easy conquest. checking their weapons and armor with the casual attitude of veterans who had never known defeat, joking among themselves about how quickly these primitive humans would fall in the medical bays. Doctors prepared for minor casualties, expecting nothing more than a few injuries from stray weapons fire. For no species had ever managed to inflict serious damage on a Dominion invasion force. The chaplains of the fleet offered prayers to the ancient gods of the Valkaran people, thanking them for another easy victory, and asking for blessings upon the warriors who would soon add another world to the glory of the Dominion. None of them could have imagined what waited for them in the space around that small blue world. None of them suspected that they were flying toward the greatest disaster in the history of their species. As the fleet engaged their jump drives and reality twisted around them, bending space and time to carry them across the vast distances between stars. The humans on Earth were already watching and waiting deep beneath the surface of their moon. Hidden installations that had been under construction for decades powered up their ancient weapon systems, preparing to deliver a greeting that the Valkaran would never forget in bunkers beneath mountains and deserts and oceans. Humanity's leaders gathered around screens showing the approaching fleet, and they did not panic or despair or argue about what to do. Instead, they smiled, because they had been preparing for this moment since the day they first detected alien signals from the depths of space. Knowing that sooner or later someone would come to take their world from them, Admiral Chun Wei-lin sat in the command center of Earth's orbital defense network, watching the countdown timer that showed how long until the enemy fleet arrived. And she felt a calm certainty settle over her heart. All stations report ready, she announced over the global communication network. Humanity stands together, and today we show the galaxy what happens when you threaten our home. The response came back from every nation and every continent. From soldiers and civilians alike, a single word repeated billions of times across the planet: ready. The Valkaran were coming with 10,000 ships and 9 million warriors, expecting to find frightened primitives waiting to surrender. But what they would find instead was a species that had spent its entire existence preparing for exactly this kind of fight. The storm was gathering, and soon it would break upon the shores of Earth. But this time, the storm would discover that humanity was not a candle to be blown out by the wind. Humanity was the fire that would burn the storm itself to ashes. The Valkaran fleet emerged from jump space at the edge of Earth's solar system. 10,000 warships appearing in perfect formation like a wall of death stretching across the void. And Admiral Dexaran felt pride swelling in his chest as he surveyed his mighty armada. Begin broadcasting the standard surrender demand, he ordered his communications officer. Let these primitives know that resistance is pointless, and that their only hope for survival lies in immediate submission to Bosby's Dominion rule. The message went out across all frequencies, promising mercy to those who surrendered and total destruction to those who resisted. The same message that had broken the spirit of hundreds of species before Thexarian expected the usual response. The panicked transmissions from terrified leaders begging for terms, the desperate attempts at negotiation, the crying and pleading that always came when inferior races realized they faced annihilation instead. There was only silence. The Admiral waited, growing increasingly irritated as minutes passed without any response from the human world, checking his equipment to make sure the transmission had been sent correctly. Perhaps their communication systems are too primitive to receive our signal, suggested his second-in-command, trying to explain the strange behavior of their targets. No, Dexaran replied with a frown. Our scouts confirm they have the technology to detect our transmissions. They are simply choosing not to respond. He ordered the fleet to advance, moving in standard conquest formation toward the blue planet that hung in the distance like a jewel waiting to be claimed, confident that the sight of his armada would break whatever foolish courage the humans possessed on Earth. Admiral Chen Weilin watched the enemy fleet approach on her tactical display, tracking their speed and formation with cold precision while her officers reported updates from every defense station on the planet. They are moving exactly as our simulations predicted, she observed quietly. Arrogant and overconfident, bunched together in tight formations that maximize their firepower but leave them vulnerable to area attacks. She had spent 20 years preparing for this moment, studying every piece of intelligence humanity had gathered about the galactic powers that surrounded them, learning their tactics and strategies and looking for weaknesses that could be exploited. The Velkorn had conquered through overwhelming force and superior technology, crushing their enemies with sheer numbers before any real resistance could be organized. But they had grown complacent over centuries of easy victories. They had forgotten what it meant to fight an enemy that was truly prepared to die rather than surrender. All channels, Admiral Chen announced, her voice calm and steady despite the weight of billions of lives resting on her shoulders. Execute Protocol Prometheus across the planet. Humanity moved as one. Civilian vessels that had been evacuating to safe positions in the asteroid belt completed their final jumps to hiding spots that had been prepared years in advance, carrying the young and the old and the sick to safety while the warriors remained behind ground-based railgun batteries that had been hidden beneath the Logan batteries that had been Helgen batteries that had been hidden beneath the surface of every continent powered up their massive capacitors, preparing to hurl projectiles into orbit at speeds that would punch through any known armor. Orbital weapons platforms that had been disguised as communication satellites and research stations dropped their civilian shells and revealed the deadly weapons they had been hiding for decades. And on the moon, deep beneath the dusty gray surface, thousands of missile silos that the Velkorn scouts had completely failed to detect began opening their hatches. The enemy fleet crossed into lunar orbit, still broadcasting demands for surrender, still expecting the humans to break at any moment. And Exeron was beginning to grow bored with the whole affair. Then the moon exploded, not literally, but it seemed that way to the Volcaran sensors as thousands of missiles launched simultaneously from the lunar surface, each one carrying a nuclear warhead wrapped around a core of dense metal designed to punch through ship armor. The first wave struck before the Dominion ships could even raise their shields, slamming into holes at incredible speeds and detonating with the force of small stars, turning proud warships into expanding clouds of debris and burning gas. 300 ships died in the first 60 seconds. Thex Rand stared at his tactical display in absolute shock, unable to process what he was seeing, unable to believe that any species would dare to strike first against the mighty Velcaran Dominion. Raise shields, he screamed at his bridge crew. All ships raise shields and return fire on those surface installations immediately. But the humans were not finished. From Earth's orbital platforms came a second wave of attacks, directed energy weapons that had been designed specifically to overload Velcoran's shield systems, followed by swarms of small drones that carried explosive charges and targeted the gaps in enemy formations. The human warships, those 47 vessels that the Dominion had dismissed as insignificant, suddenly appeared from behind the planet where they had been hiding, not to engage in direct combat, but to launch boarding pods at the confused enemy fleet. Velcoran commanders watched in disbelief as small metal cylinders slammed into their hulls and began cutting through armor, unable to understand why any species would attempt something so suicidal as breaching an enemy ship during active combat. Inside those pods were Earth's finest warriors, men and women wearing powered armor that enhanced their strength and speed, carrying weapons designed for close quarters, fighting in the tight corridors of enemy vessels. They burst through the hulls and began slaughtering everything they found, moving through the alien ships with brutal efficiency, shooting and stabbing and crushing any Valkaran warrior who stood in their way. The aliens had never fought against infantry, never needed to defend their ships against boarding parties, never imagined that anyone would be crazy enough to try such a thing in the middle of a space battle within hours. Dozens of Dominion vessels went dark, not destroyed but captured. Their crews eliminated by human marines, who showed no fear and no mercy. Admiral Dexaron received damage reports from across his fleet, watching his numerical advantage shrink with every passing minute. And for the first time in his 3-century career, he felt something cold crawling up his spine. How is this possible? He whispered to himself, staring at the tactical display that showed his ships dying one after another. They were supposed to be primitives. They were supposed to surrender. His second-in-command approached with a datapad, showing analysis of the human weapons and tactics. His face pale with fear as he delivered his report. Admiral, these humans have been preparing for our arrival for decades. Everything we are seeing was planned and practiced long before we ever entered their system. And they show no signs of slowing down or retreating. Dexaram looked out the viewing window at the chaos of battle, at the burning wrecks of his proud warships, at the small human vessels darting through his formation like predators hunting prey. He had expected an easy conquest, a simple victory to add to his already impressive record. But instead he had found something that the Valkaran Dominion had never encountered before, an enemy that refused to be afraid. Commander Yuki Tanaka gripped the controls of her fighter as she led the 7th Orbital Assault Wing directly into the heart of the Valkaran formation, weaving between plasma blasts that could vaporize her ship in an instant. Knowing that every second she survived was another second for Earth's defenses to tear the enemy apart. All wings, stay tight and keep moving, she called out over the radio. We are not here to win this fight alone. We are here to create chaos and confusion while the ground batteries reload. Her pilots responded with affirmatives, their voices steady despite the impossible odds they faced. Trained from birth to accept that death was always possible, and that fear was just another obstacle to overcome, the Valkaran gunners struggled to track the small human fighters, their targeting systems designed for engaging large warships, rather than tiny vessels that moved like insects through the spaces between their fleet. Tanaka spotted a carrier ship ahead. Its hangar bay doors opened to launch its own fighters, and she made a split-second decision that would have seemed insane to any other species. Wing 3. Follow me in, she ordered. We are going through that hangar. Her pilots did not hesitate, following their commander as she dove straight toward the open doors of the enemy carrier, firing missiles ahead of her to clear a path through the defenders, then pulling up at the last moment to skim along the interior ceiling of the hangar bay. The Valkaran crew inside panicked as human fighters screamed through their ship, launching ordnance at fuel lines and ammunition stores before exiting through the far side. And seconds later, the carrier erupted from within as a chain reaction of explosions tore it apart. This was how humans fought, not with elegant strategies or careful calculations of acceptable losses, but with wild aggression and a willingness to take risks that no sane species would consider across the battle space. The Valkaran fleet was learning this lesson in the most painful way possible on the heavy cruiser Velthorin. Captain Drixon watched in horror as a human boarding team cut through his ship's corridors with brutal efficiency, their powered armor shrugging off plasma fire while their weapons tore through his warriors like paper. They are in Section 7, one of his officers reported, his voice trembling with fear. And they have already killed everyone in Sections 3 through 6. We cannot stop them. Drixon had faced many enemies in his long career, but he had never seen anything like these humans. These creatures, who charged into certain death with smiles on their faces, who laughed as they killed, who seemed to enjoy the violence in a way that made his blood run cold. a human marine burst through the bridge door. Her armor splattered with purple Velcaran blood, and Drixon had just enough time to see the strange expression on her face before she raised her weapon. She was not afraid. She was not angry. She was simply doing a job that she had trained her entire life to do. And she did it with terrible perfection on Earth's surface. The ground invasion was going even worse for the Dominion forces. Vexaron had ordered landing parties to establish footholds in major cities, expecting to find terrified civilians who would surrender at the sight of alien soldiers. But instead he found something far more dangerous. Every city was a fortress, its buildings reinforced with hidden armor, its streets lined with traps and ambush points, its people armed with weapons that ranged from military-grade rifles to homemade explosives that could take out armored vehicles. The humans had been preparing for this invasion for decades, distributing weapons to their entire population, training ordinary citizens in guerrilla warfare, building secret tunnels and bunkers beneath every neighborhood. Velcaran troops marched into a city called Tokyo, expecting easy conquest, and found themselves in a nightmare of endless urban combat, where enemies attacked from every direction and then vanished before they could be targeted. Children threw grenades from windows. Old women triggered bombs hidden in baby carriages. Businessmen in suits pulled rocket launchers from briefcases and destroyed tanks before disappearing into the subway system. "They are insane," a Velcaran ground commander reported to the fleet, his voice barely audible over the sound of explosions in the background. "Every single one of them is fighting. We cannot tell civilians from soldiers. They are all the same." In a city called New York, the Dominion forces thought they had secured a major building complex, only to discover that the humans had rigged the entire structure with explosives and were willing to bring it down on top of everyone inside, their own people included. The building collapsed with thousands still fighting within its walls, killing Velcaran and human alike. And when the dust cleared, the surviving aliens found fresh human forces already moving in to attack them again. This was the horror that the Dominion had never understood. That humans did not fight to survive, they fought to win. And they were willing to pay any price to achieve victory. Admiral Vexaron received reports of disaster after disaster, watching his forces ground down by an enemy that seemed to have unlimited reserves of both weapons and courage. And he began to realize that he had made a terrible miscalculation. "Sir," his tactical officer called out with obvious fear in his voice, "we are detecting a new threat. The humans are redirecting asteroids toward our fleet using nuclear detonations. We need to disperse our formation immediately." Vexaron looked at the display and felt his heart sink as he saw massive rocks hurtling toward his ships, turned into weapons by an enemy that was willing to reshape the very solar system to destroy him. "They are using everything," he said quietly. "Every rock, every piece of debris, every ship they have. They are throwing it all at us without any concern for their own losses." His second-in-command approached with yet another report, this one even more disturbing than the last admiral. "Our intelligence division has intercepted human communications. They are celebrating. Their leaders are giving speeches about how well the battle is going. Their people are cheering in the streets despite the destruction of their own cities." Vexaron could not understand it, could not process how any species could find joy in the middle of such carnage. But the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. The humans were not fighting a desperate last stand against extinction. They were waging a war of extermination against the Velcaran fleet, and they were winning somewhere in the chaos of battle. A small human strike team was approaching Vexaron's flagship, carrying with them a message that would break the Admiral's spirit more completely than any weapon ever could. The horror of human warfare was only beginning. Copy publish adaptation and annihilation. 72 hours had passed since the invasion began. And Admiral Vexaron stood in his command center surrounded by the wreckage of his dreams of easy conquest. watching his once mighty fleet burn in the cold darkness of space. Of the 10,000 ships that had entered the human system, fewer than 4,000 remained operational, and that number was shrinking with every passing hour as the relentless human attacks continued without pause. "How is this possible?" he said to the empty air. Unable to understand how a species with inferior technology and fewer ships could inflict such devastating losses on the greatest military force in the galaxy, his officers moved around him in silence, afraid to speak, afraid to draw attention to themselves as their admiral's mood grew darker. With each new report of disaster, the humans had proven to be something the Velkarn had never encountered in all their centuries of conquest. An enemy that learned and adapted faster than any species had a right to, turning every Dominion tactic against itself within hours of seeing it used. When the Velkoran had tried to use their superior shields to push through human defenses, the humans had developed weapons specifically designed to overload those shields, stripping them away and leaving the ships vulnerable to conventional attack. When the Dominion had attempted to use their faster ships to outmaneuver the human fleet, the humans had filled the battle space with clouds of metallic debris that shredded sensors and made high-speed travel impossible. When Nexaron had ordered his ships to spread out to avoid the asteroid attacks, the humans had simply adjusted their tactics, using smaller weapons that could hit individual targets with terrifying precision. Every move the Admiral made was countered. Every strategy was defeated. Every advantage was neutralized by an enemy that seemed to have infinite creativity and absolutely no fear of death. The ground war had become even worse, with Velkaran commanders refusing to send any more troops to the surface after the horrors they had witnessed in the first few days. Human civilians had fought with the same ferocity as trained soldiers, using weapons that ranged from advanced military equipment to primitive clubs and knives, attacking with such savage determination that even the bravest Dominion warriors had broken and fled. Reports had come in of humans strapping explosives to their own bodies and running into groups of Velkarn soldiers, of children operating remote-controlled drones packed with grenades, of entire neighborhoods rising up in coordinated attacks that overwhelmed even the most heavily armed invasion forces. They do not fight like any species we have ever encountered, the head of military intelligence had reported. They fight like cornered animals, but with the intelligence and coordination of a civilization that has spent millennia perfecting the art of killing. The worst part was the human communications. The messages that the Dominion had intercepted and translated, revealing that the humans were not desperate or frightened, but confident and even cheerful. Their leaders spoke of the invasion as an opportunity to show the galaxy what humanity was capable of. Their soldiers joked about alien hunting season. Their civilians organized block parties where they celebrated each enemy ship destroyed. It was as if the entire species had been waiting for this war, preparing for it, even hoping for it, and now that it had finally arrived, they were enjoying themselves. Dexaron had tried to contact Earth's leadership to negotiate a ceasefire, offering terms that would have seemed generous to any other species. But the humans had simply laughed at him. "You came here to conquer us," the human Admiral Chun had said in her response. "And now you want peace because you are losing. Perhaps you should have thought about that before you brought your ships into our home." The message had ended with a single word that the translation software had struggled to interpret. A human expression that seemed to mean something like, "We are not finished with you yet." On the third night of the invasion, something happened that broke Thexaron's spirit more completely than all the military defeats combined. He had retired to his personal quarters to rest, leaving his second-in-command in charge of the bridge. And when he woke, he found that his flagship had been infiltrated by a human strike team. They had somehow bypassed every security system, somehow avoided every patrol, somehow made their way through a ship filled with thousands of Valkoran warriors without being detected, and they had left a message carved into the metal of Dexeron's command chair, scratched deep into the surface by a blade that had been dragged slowly and deliberately across the polished material. Were words in the human language that his translator rendered into Valkoran speech. "We know where your homeworld is." The Admiral stared at those words for a long time, feeling a cold terror spreading through his body. Understanding for the first time the true nature of the enemy he faced, the humans were not just defending their world. They were not just trying to survive. They were sending a message to the entire Dominion, to every species in the galaxy that might think about attacking them. They were saying that no one who threatened Earth would ever be safe, that humanity would hunt them across the stars if necessary, that this war would not end until one side or the other was completely destroyed. Dexeron called an emergency meeting of his surviving commanders, presenting them with the evidence of the infiltration and asking for their counsel on how to proceed. "We must withdraw," said Admiral Krentok of the 3rd Battle Group. "This invasion has become a disaster. We have lost more ships in 3 days than we lost in the last century of conquest. And there is no sign that the humans are weakening. Withdrawal would be shameful," argued General Vex Thorin of the ground forces, though his voice lacked conviction. "We have never retreated from any battle in the history of our species. We've also never faced an enemy like this," Krentok replied. "These humans are not like the others. They do not break. They do not surrender. They only adapt and attack and kill." Dexeron listened to his commanders argue, but his mind kept returning to those words carved into his chair, to the realization that a human team had stood in his own quarters while he slept, close enough to kill him, and had chosen instead to leave a warning. They had wanted him to know that they could have killed him, that he was only alive because they had decided to let him live. And that message was more terrifying than any military defeat. "Sound the retreat," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "All ships are to withdraw to the edge of the system immediately." "We are leaving." His commanders stared at him in shock, unable to believe what they were hearing. But Dexeron had made his decision. The Valkoran Dominion had finally met an enemy they could not conquer. And the Admiral was beginning to understand that survival might be the only victory they could hope to achieve. The war was lost, but the real nightmare was only beginning. 1 year had passed since the invasion of Earth, and the great council chamber of the Valkoran Dominion was filled with silence as Sub-Commander Velthex walked slowly toward the speaking platform at the center of the room. The perk slowly to room, the pred slowly toward the speaking platform at the center of the room. Ancient counselors who ruled the Dominion sat in their elevated seats, their faces showing curiosity and impatience and barely hidden contempt, for they had summoned this lowly officer to explain how the greatest military force in galactic history had been humiliated by a species of primitives. Velthex climbed the steps to the platform and stood before the assembled leaders of his people, feeling the weight of their stares upon him, knowing that what he was about to say would change the course of Valkoran history forever. He was the highest-ranking survivor of the Earth invasion fleet, the sole officer who had witnessed the disaster from beginning to end and lived to tell the tale. And his testimony would be recorded in the archives for future generations to study. "You may begin," said the High Counselor, an ancient female whose scales had faded to gray with age, her voice carrying the authority of centuries of rule. Velthex bowed his head respectfully before speaking, gathering his thoughts and trying to find words that could convey the horror of what he had experienced. "Honored counselors, I stand before you as a broken officer who watched 9 million of our finest warriors die in the space of 7 days. And I am here to tell you that we brought this disaster upon ourselves through arrogance and ignorance." Murmurs of outrage rippled through the chamber, but Velthex continued without pause. We sent 10,000 ships to conquer a world defended by 47 vessels, believing that our superior numbers and technology would guarantee an easy victory. And we were wrong in ways that I still struggle to comprehend. He activated the holographic display that floated above the platform, filling the chamber with images and recordings from the battle. And the counselors fell silent as they watched the evidence of the disaster unfold. This is footage from the opening minutes of the invasion. Valfax explained as missiles erupted from the lunar surface. The humans had spent decades preparing for our arrival, building weapons installations that our scouts failed to detect. And they struck first without warning or hesitation. The display showed Valkoran ships exploding, warriors dying, formations breaking apart under the relentless human assault. And several counselors turned away from the images in disgust. We made assumptions about the humans that proved to be catastrophically incorrect. We assumed that a species would prioritize survival over victory. We assumed that inferior technology meant inferior warriors. We assumed that they would break under pressure as every other species had done before. Valfax paused, letting the weight of his words sink in before continuing. They did not break. Honored counselors, they adapted. Every tactic we used was countered within hours. Every weapon we deployed was captured and turned against us. Every strategy we attempted was defeated by an enemy that seemed to know exactly what we would do before we did it. The display changed to show footage from the ground invasion. Human civilians fighting alongside soldiers. Explosions ripping through Dominion formations. Warriors running in terror from enemies who showed no mercy. On the surface, the situation was even worse. The humans had armed their entire population with weapons and trained them all in combat. Every man and woman and child was a potential enemy, and they fought with a savagery that our troops had never encountered. An old counselor leaned forward in his seat, his face showing disbelief and anger. "Surely you exaggerate. Sub-Commander, our warriors are the finest in the galaxy. They have conquered over 300 species. How could they be defeated by primitive ground fighters?" Valfax turned to face the counselor directly, his eyes burning with memories that would haunt him until the day he died. "With respect, honored counselor, I watched a human child no older than 10 cycles throw an explosive device into a group of our elite soldiers and kill them all. I watched an elderly human female drive a vehicle filled with bombs into one of our command posts. I watched humans set their own cities on fire rather than let us occupy them." He gestured to the display, which now showed the message carved into Admiral Lexeron's command chair. "And I was present when we discovered that a human strike team had infiltrated our flagship, bypassing every security measure we possessed, standing in the Admiral's own quarters while he slept, close enough to kill him. And they chose instead to leave this message." The words hung in the air of the council chamber, and for a long moment, no one spoke. "They know where our homeworld is," Valfax said quietly, "and they wanted us to know that they know. They wanted us to understand that this war will not end until they decide it is over." The High Counselor rose from her seat, her ancient body trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. "What happened to Admiral Lex Aran?" she demanded. "He died during the retreat." "Honored Counselor, his ship was destroyed by a human vessel that rammed it at near light speed. The crew of that human ship sacrificed themselves to take him down. And based on their communications, they considered it a fair trade." Valfax deactivated the display and faced the council one final time. Of the 10,000 ships that entered human space, only 23 escaped. Of the 9 million warriors who went to conquer Earth, only a few 100,000 returned. And the humans are already rebuilding their forces and expanding their fleet. He reached into his uniform and pulled out a datapad, holding it up for the counselors to see. "Our intelligence network reports that the humans have begun constructing what they call the Liberation Fleet. Ships built using technology they captured from us during the battle. And they have announced to the galaxy that they will bring justice to any species that threatens innocent worlds. The chamber erupted in chaos, counselors shouting over each other, demanding explanations and assigning blame and calling for immediate action. But Velthex simply stood on the platform and waited for the noise to die down. And when it finally did, he spoke the words that would echo through Velkaran history for generations to come. The humans have a saying on their world: an eye for an eye. It means that whatever harm you do to them will be returned to you in equal measure. And I pray that this council understands what that means. He turned and began walking toward the exit, ignoring the shouts and questions that followed him, because I assure you, honored counselors, the humans understand it perfectly. And they are coming for us? 3 years later, the Liberation Fleet appeared at the edge of Velkaran space, 10,000 ships strong, crewed by warriors from 100 different species that humanity had freed from Dominion oppression. The humans had not come to conquer. They had not come for revenge. They had come to liberate every world that the Velkaran had ever oppressed. And this time, it was the Dominion that would learn what it meant to face an enemy that refused to surrender. The galaxy would never be the same.